Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I am so excited. I've been waiting to interview David Lipsky literally for a year since I saw his Rolling Stone piece, How Sun Myung Moon Digested the Scientists and Fueled Climate Change Denial. And for all my regular listeners, you know that I was in the Moonies cult. And so I know all about the Washington Times and its propagandistic history and its editors with the Council of National Policy, etc. But man, oh man, I rushed out and I bought his book, The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial, David Lipsky, New York Times bestselling author. David, I just want to read some laudatories about you. You are a contributing writer for Rolling Stone. Of course, you did that piece. You are the author of the New York Times bestsellers, Absolutely American. And although, of course, you end up becoming yourself, which was the basis for the acclaimed movie, The End of the Tour, you've written for The New Yorker, New York Times, Harper's, American Life, All Things Considered. Man, you've been everywhere. But now I want to say about the book. So I want to read some of the literature just to set it up, because there isn't a day that goes by that we don't hear some horrible story somewhere around the world of a 1,000-year event, but they're happening every day. So, and your book was really educational. What a well-researched book you have. So you explored in it how anti-science became virulent in American life through the history of climate denial and its consequences. Climate change has become an unavoidable fact and an ongoing catastrophe. The science was clear decades ago. How did so many Americans come to doubt evidence so widely accepted and compelling? Well, The Parrot and the Igloo is the story of inventors, Edison, Tesla, Westinghouse, who made our modern world, the scientists who bravely sounded the climate alarm, and then the hucksters, zealots, dreamers, and crackpots who lied about that science. David, you showed how climate denial grew out of early efforts to build a network of untruth about products like aspirin, automobiles, and cigarettes. Remember, the big tobacco said there's no evidence that smoking causes cancer. Lies. Revealing the infrastructure that allowed denier ideas to take hold and the untrue replace the true. You deliver the real-life tragic comedy, and it's just a tragedy, one that captures the extraordinary dance of science, money, and the American character. Thank you for this incredible book, The Parrot and the Igloo. I really recommend it. It's out now in paperback. I bought the original hardback last year and listened to it as well, I might add. And with that, David Lipsky, welcome to the Influence Continuum.
It's a pleasure to finally be here, Steve. Thanks.
Yeah. So I guess I want to start, if you don't mind, where you want to start with what got you interested in doing this massive, this was a huge research project. Man, oh man.
Yeah, it's always funny when you hear the jacket copy and you always want to change it because writers tend to do their own jacket copy. And I was like, wow, I just made it sound like the instructions on the airplane that you just tune vaguely out through. Steve, you did a great reading of it, but you're listening to it and you get that thought like, wow, if I could just go back and just say, this book is an extraordinary story about how we missed a chance. Now, I had looked forward to talking to you. I read a lot of your stuff when I was researching the book because the Reverend Moon's organization plays a
Don't
pivotal...
call him Reverend with me,
yes.
please. He was not ordained. He was a self-appointed Messiah.
Not just that, he was blackballed, right? He was exiled. He was voted out of the National Council of Churches, and then for good measure, even from the New York State Council of Churches. And he was not allowed to set foot in the nation of Britain Um,
Yes.
but what started
And
me
he's a
was,
felon.
yeah,
He was a felon. He's dead. Now his sons are taken over, and that's another part of the story, and the wife. But go on, please.
but 13 months in Danbury Fed.
Right.
Yeah. Um, but what started me is I was working on a different project. And as part of my research, I was looking at stuff from the 1950s and the 70s. And I was shocked that President Carter, climate change was already a fairly well known phenomenon by the 1970s. It had been thoroughly vetted for a century. And
Yep.
from the 1950s, we began to understand not that it was something over the horizon 2 or 3 or 4 centuries from now, but that it was likely to start happening around the 90s or around the aughts.
Yep.
And scientists are very much like the people who vet new drugs. And so we began changing our estimate of what would happen in the late 50s. And 18, 19 years of research. By the middle 70s, giant reports started coming in. And so President Carter turned to the National Academy of Science. That is an organization started by President Lincoln, and it is our best scientists. It's sort of like if the Hall of Fame, the players stayed on the field. That's what the National Academy of Science is like. 2,200 scientists, the best scientists in the country, and you could make an argument in the world. President Carter receives a report saying this is going to start happening in the 90s, and he is understandably vexed, and he turns to the National Academy of Sciences in July of 1979 and says, is this going to happen? And the report comes back quickly, and the report had this conclusion. The results of our survey will be reassuring to scientists, because scientists don't like to get things wrong, but disturbing to policymakers and leaders. If the carbon dioxide release continues, this panel finds no reason to believe that climate changes will not result, and no reason to believe that those changes will be negligible. We had that on July 29th, 1979, and we took no action. Now, that was stunning. It was like being in the attic and finding that all we had to do was fill out a card and return it in the mail, and we would have a wonderful beach house in Montauk. And for some reason, we didn't take that step. That was the reason I began researching it. Really, I'm saying it as sort of a funny thing, but I was stunned.
Yeah, if I may add from my own research from the Cult of Trump book that came out in 2019, a point of information that I think is relevant for our listeners, and that is in 1980, the year after this report, William Lind, L-I-N-D, who is an American military strategist, wrote a paper about fourth generation psychological warfare. And this is an approach that attacks experts, science, and democratic institutions. And the man who educated me about fourth generation warfare is a Stanford PhD in political sociology, James Scamacci III. And basically, it was a psychological operation to cause distrust in science and to just do what big tobacco is failing to do, which is, legislate against the sale of cigarettes because it was killing people. But they started applying it to the fossil fuel global climate crisis in my research, especially because you connected me to the Moonies. The Moonies were a right wing. I mean, the Washington Times was, they go way back to this group of Koch corporation, fossil fuel, and not to mention other countries that do fossil fuel. So forgive me for interrupting you, David.
Oh, God, not at all. No,
and Lind met with Trump in the White House when he was president. And we know that Trump recently met with all these fossil fuel corporate heads, reassuring them that if they got him into power, that he would roll back all of the legislation that the Biden administration is trying to get going. So anyway.
Yeah, that's not terribly surprising to hear.
Anyway, back to your research and your book. So tell us more about this incredible history of denial.
Oh, Steve, so it was shocking to know just how long we have known about climate. Generally, like, Steve, you've done research, but for most people, they tend to think that kind of we started hearing about this maybe around the turn of the century. So, 90s, 2000s, they associate it with Al Gore. It was shocking to me to learn. I mean, when do you think the first research was? I mean, from the book, so I won't ask you questions that you now can answer. But we as a people started researching this in the 1820s. And people like the scientists who were hired by the tobacco companies, then by the Moonies, and then by the fossil fuel companies, they made it seem as if it was a kind of fringe science, like it was the people who showed up for work, not showered, and had taken the bus, not people who were officially sanctioned members of the research community. But it was always the mainstream. It was always leaders of the mainstream. So the first scientist to research it in the 1820s was one of the leading mathematicians of his era, a guy named Fourier. And he wondered what keeps the Earth warm. And so he thought, hey, the sun comes down, hits the Earth, and why does it stay here? For example, the same sun hits the moon, and the moon is chilly and nothing grows there. So what he deduced was that there had to be something. He was French. So there had to be something like the lid on a casserole pot, a glass lid that let the sunlight come in and then captured the heat. And then about 40 years later, the leading scientist of his time in Britain, a man named John Tyndall, asked himself, well, what is the stuff in the atmosphere that's keeping this here? And he went through every atmospheric, participle. He went through oxygen, he went through nitrogen, and he was going to give it up. It took him months. He even had someone from the perfume industry come and bring him all the perfumes to see if it was sandalwood or cinnamon. When he was about to give up, he checked coal gas, and coal gas was what was produced by gaslight, which has a different meaning for us now, and especially in talking about cults.
Yep.
But then what it had to do with was what was lighting the streets. It was a giant revolution when you could have streetlights, cut down on crime, you could have parties, you could have people going out for walks. You didn't have a nightlife before gaslighting came in 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, because people were anxious, understandably, to go out. So he checked coal gas, which was the residue from gaslight, and it was the thing that and water vapor were keeping, that was the lid. So, Steve, the way it works, if you've been wondering how climate change works and why carbon dioxide keeps heat, do you ever drive to like the airport and there are those kind of like talon things that you go over? So your tires bump over when you go in. And if you try to back out once you see what the rates are for parking, they will tear your tires off. You can't leave. That is how carbon dioxide affects sunlight. Sunlight comes in, and then it has to stay, basically. So Tyndall was thrilled. And then he said that, this is a lovely phrase, and this is 1859, 1860. He said that it was as necessary to the vegetable life of the world as a blanket is for someone sleeping. And if you strip that blanket, even for just one evening, the sun would rise on an England in the captive grip of iron frost. So, wow. 35 years after that, the leading scientist in Sweden, a man named Svante Arrhenius. Now, he would be Sweden's first Nobel Prize winner, and he would also lead the Nobel Labs. So again, completely mainstream as Fourier and Tyndall. He had just started a marriage. He had gotten married in 1894 in the summer, and you can tell that the marriage wasn't working especially well because Christmas Eve, he sat down, wasn't socializing, wasn't going to a party with other young couples. He began researching this issue, and he didn't get up for about a year. What he calculated was, okay, if we know that carbon dioxide, if we know that that's what keeps the heat in, no one had asked that question because there really hadn't been that much more carbon dioxide, that much more smoke. But the Sweden that Arrhenius was in was a slightly smokier place. If we lowered carbon dioxide, if we halved it, it would be cold enough for the ice ages. If we doubled it, you would actually have temperatures go up 4 and 9%. And that was great news for Arrhenius. He's in Sweden. So, and his friends, who are all fellow scientists, they didn't want to wait the many hundreds of years that it seemed like it would take for the carbon dioxide to accumulate. They said, let's take some coal mines, ones that are kind of empty. Let's just light them on fire, and they'll send out smoke, and we can have a warmer Sweden now. But that is, the 4 to 9 degree estimate about what would happen if we doubled climate, if we doubled atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's been accurate. That is basically the number that the computers began to come up with at the end of the last century. Anyway, people began noticing very quickly that things were starting to heat up. And to get a sense of just how far back this goes, 1933, there's a headline above the fold in the New York Times. On the left, there is a story about putting Al Capone's speakeasies out of business. On the right, there's a story about the Nazis, about Hitler, and it's saying Nazis promised to end attacks on Jews in the Reich. And then in the middle, there's the headline that America in longest heat wave in its history, 25-year rise, longest since 1776. That's how long the story has been with us. And that was a total shock to me. And the fact that we have known that, we've known this long, and we have taken almost no action, that was such fascinating news that I wanted to tell the story about why.
Yeah,
tell the
really.
what and the why.
And all I can say is, we develop technologies, and in the short run, they have great benefits, but we don't often think about the downsides, especially if things, get abused in the way that they do.
That was, so the book is cut, Stephen, in 3 segments, and which was a very fun way to do it. I wanted it to be sort of like Netflix, where you could watch different seasons. And you could, if you wanted to start with the Deniers, you could watch the Denier season. And if you wanted to start where the book begins with it, which is just with the inventors, the people who gave us all the cool stuff. Like you and I are talking through a glass window. Like I'm in New York City. Steve, where are you?
In Boston.
You're in Boston. So we are talking across hundreds of miles through a glass window, basically, a piece of glass on metal. And that goes back to Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla popularizing the use of electricity, finding a killer app for electricity. That's amazing. The second section, so that's the first section, is how our world was made. The second section is about the scientists who were like, wait, this could be a bit of a problem. And they're like an amazing, in a way, they're as inventive, certainly as ingenious as Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison, with very few clues. They were like a CSI team. Like, something is going on. What is it? Like, carbon dioxide is only a small part of our atmosphere. Could this be what is heating us up? And over about a 70 or 80 year period, they proved that it was actually going to happen, that it was going to happen in the time that we're living in. And then the last section, which is the section that I know caught your eye with the astonishing surprise that the Moonies had helped along in this effort, is about the deniers, the people who tried to cover up that information. And again, it was a shocking story. It was thrilling to learn about. And then it was great to be telling the story.
Right. And they weren't just saying, it's not true. They were doing all kinds of disinformation, putting out disinformation, and then just saying, well, there are all these other theories and we need more research. They've been using that for decades. We just need to do more research to really prove it. But in the meantime, I literally, David, was interviewed yesterday with a UK podcast, and she was, when I said about the moon, I quoted you, and I said about the Moonies with climate science denial, and they're like, I'm going to be hearing from my listeners that I'm in the cult of climate change. And I'm like, yeah, that's called projection. That's a psychological warfare technique to distract people from the attention they need to put on the facts. and, get people on the
That's often
defense.
family warfare and business warfare too. Projection. So yes, it's something that's familiar to anybody who has been in any human relationship of any kind.
Yep. So, I just want to come back for a second to the fascinating story about Tesla and Edison, and how there was like a war of direct current and alternating current comes back to me in reading your book. I never heard that story.
Yeah, business is cutthroat. I mean, it was like the fights between Jobs and Bill Gates. They both had different visions for what would be the operating system for electricity. The weird thing is that Edison's guessed that we should have the power plants close to where the use is being made of the electricity. There's a chance that we're going to circle back to that because it's more efficient. But there were millions, billions, and eventually trillions of dollars at stake. And right from the beginning, people understood it. So you had people who worked for Edison. The people who worked for Tesla were doing things like trying to chop the Edison cables.
Huh.
And the people who worked for Edison, George Westinghouse, the washing machine and dishwashing guy, he was backing Tesla. He was Tesla's money guy. And so what Edison's people did was they helped the electric chair get adopted for executions. And the reason that they wanted that to happen was they knew that they would be using Westinghouse current. And so Edison thought that he could kill Tesla's approach to electricity by making the slang for, being executed, getting Westinghouse. And so he thought if he could just get people to use the chair more, they would say, hey, I don't want to get Westinghouse, and that would kill Tesla.
And that's crazy. But I want to just say for our listeners that Tesla was for alternating current as opposed to direct current.
That's right.
And that I think Tesla kind of made a personal sacrifice because he thought it would be better for humanity to have alternating current. I don't know, that's my recollection from reading your book.
That's absolutely right. But the thing about Tesla is that comes from his memoirs. And Tesla is one of those people who's using a really heavy Insta filter on his memoirs.
I see.
So I know that legally what happened was that the Westinghouse, exactly like the kinds of stuff that happen in Silicon Valley now, the biggest asset that the Westinghouse company owned were the patents for Tesla's discovery, how you could move current into people's homes and even from far away things like waterfalls. Mm-hmm. So it's a giant technological innovation that he'd made.
Yep.
But it was also a tremendous liability for the Westinghouse company. He had a royalty on every watt. And so George Westinghouse came to his lab and hemmed and hawed and said, look, we can't go ahead if we're going to have to pay you the money. I think millions of people listening who have worked in Hollywood or worked in Palo Alto are getting the shivers from hearing this about Tesla. Mm-hmm. So what Westinghouse said to Tesla is, we can't go ahead. And so Tesla said, it means more to me and to humanity that my alternating current be given a shot. So here's my contract, here's your copy of it, and I'm tearing them both to pieces.
Yes. So I just want to say, anyone in Hollywood or at Netflix, do this into a docuseries, please, because, a lot of young people especially are not reading books the way they should be reading books, but they need to have this information because it's history. And before we go on, David, could you explain why you chose this arcane title of The Parrot and the
Sure.
Igloo? Because when I tell people The Parrot and the Igloo, they're like, eh? Like, what? What?
Two reasons. Basically, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but so there's like a shadow reason, and then there's the main reason. Uh-huh. The shadow reason is, and I think it's one of the reasons why we haven't gotten as much action as we might have gotten on climate. America tends to have an adversarial, a binary culture. So we see things just in A and B, cat or dog, coffee or tea, winter, summer, Pepsi or Coke. It's not like there's many, right? There's Pepsi or there's Coke. There's Apple or there is Android. Not like there's 7 things, there's just 2 things. And that becomes a problem, especially just for the people who are following politics and trying to decide what their opinion should be. which is that they always know that the people on one side or the other will make their point either too large or too small. And I think we've gotten so used to that I think when we hear once an issue moves from being a new issue to joining the supporting cast, the pantheon of all our issues, I think people say, one side's exaggerating, one side is under-exaggerating, anti-exaggerating, and we're going to just tune out until some decision is reached. Yeah. So that's the shadow meaning. But the actual meaning is this was so thoroughly known by 1956 that the Times, the first American climate scientist, the first giant one, another member of the mainstream, a guy named Roger Revelle. And he had helped to start the Bureau of Ships during World War II, and he worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence. And he looked at Arrhenius's results, at Arrhenius's equations, and he realized that it was not going to be hundreds of years from now. In 1956, he checked the equations, and he was checking them to verify that they were true. He was trying to, and this is often what science is. Science itself is really adversarial. He wanted to make fun of somebody else who was warning it was happening now. So he checked Arrhenius's figures, and it turned out they were slightly wrong, but only in one direction. He had thought that all the extra carbon dioxide would be soaked up by the oceans and then released slowly over time. And so that was why it would be hundreds of years before you'd get a major temperature increase. Revelle was an oceanographer. He knew how long the water holds things. And yeah, the ocean would hold the carbon dioxide, and then it would just release it again fairly quickly. And so in 1956, he said, in 50 years, not in hundreds of years, in 50 years, this may have a violent effect on Earth's climate. He didn't say that in, that was 1956. He didn't say it in the Journal of Applied Meteorology, or he didn't say it in Tellus, which is another meteorological journal. He said it in Time magazine. And the title wasn't a hidden one. The title was One Big Greenhouse. And that same year, that was in May of 56. So almost 70 years ago, last month. The Times covering it also. It was a big issue in the 50s. And in October of 1956, another great Navy scientist, a man named Gilbert Plass, was talking to the Times, and the Times summarized Dr. Plass's research, and they said eventually it will turn the Arctic areas into tropical jungles with gaudy parrots squawking from the trees. So it began as a parrot, and then from the 50s to the 70s, this issue began to enter the octagon of national politics. And by the time it emerged in 2010, right, it's fought, it's tried to hold its head up, it's been hit from the many variety of sources, the many kicks and elbows and punches you get from many different angles once you become a national issue. When it emerged in 2010, a conservative senator named James Inhofe, he was in D.C. There was a heavy snowfall in February of 2010, and he saw, and he and his family built an igloo on the Washington Mall, and they put two signs on it, Al Gore's new house, and also honk if you heart global warming. And so what the title means is, how did we go? This is the non-shadow, but this is the billboard meaning, is how did we go? How did the story take us from a parrot to an igloo?
There's so many directions I want to go with you, but, I could listen to you for a really long time, but I guess
this is a very suspenseful pause.
I didn't write out questions because I just knew the depth of the research that you did and such, but
we could talk about the Moonies, which is a fascinating story.
Please do. Please tell us what you learned. I can tell you my side of it. I already mentioned a little bit about the Council for National Policy who installed the editor, but I can please share.
So in our era, there was money to be made being a scientist who would say things that institutions and commercial enterprises need said. This goes back, cigarettes pioneered it, but the Moonies, and the Moonies were a giant organization. They were beaten. They weren't especially beaten. They just sort of were beaten by their own hubris and overreach. But they were the most influential conservative funders from the middle of the 70s until, Steve, when would you say their influence diminished? Would you say it was from Nansuk's memoir?
In
I
the
mean, that is when
United
it really
States,
collapsed.
yes. But if I may interrupt your narrative for a second,
Sure.
I was a leader in the cult. When I was deprogrammed after nearly dying in a van crash, and I learned about what brainwashing was and such, and got out, I became a whistleblower for the Fraser investigation that was looking into the Korean CIA activities of the Moonies in the United States, because the number two politician in the embassy of South Korea defected, a KCIA agent defected with their 8-point
Mm,
plans for covert operations in the US, and the Moonies were one of them. So I turned over all of the master speaks, all of Father's speeches about taking over the government and infiltrating and getting rid of the government. And I naively thought that this investigation would shut the Moonies down. So I
mm.
really didn't follow them until their final report came out October 31st, 1978, 18
That's right.
days before Jonestown. So essentially, the final report came out. There were 80 pages on the Moonies. They talked about Korean CIA activities. They said there was so much violation of U.S. laws that they recommended an interagency task force be set up. And 18 days later, Jonestown happened, and Senator Dole invited me to speak at Congress about cults. And I came down. I'll make this fast. I came to D.C. and the Moonies were picketing him, saying, elect Bob Dole president, repeal the Second Amendment, the First Amendment rather. And I was taken off the agenda, and I was like, wait a minute. Leo Ryan, Congressman Ryan, was on this investigation into the KCIA. He was murdered. What's going on? So I sat down and I read 11 volumes of the investigation. And the thing that stood out for me was the founder of the Korean CIA's testimony under oath said that he, quote, organized and utilized the Unification Church for use as a political tool, end
Mm.
quote. And what I came to learn and understand is that America was wanting to leave the Vietnam War. The Moonies were used in South Korea. There had been 2 unsuccessful coups. North Korea was brainwashing people, and somebody in the CIA set up the KCIA, and they're like, we need to have a education program against dissidents, and they used the Moonies as a proxy group. And it was
Mm.
only when America was pulling out of Vietnam that they brought the Moonies to the US. And that's when they set up the Washington Times. So, in other words, from my vantage point on this has been a right wing conspiracy. We're going to advance our agenda. And it doesn't necessarily align with democracy and human rights values, etc. And I got recruited on campus to recruit students against commies, and told to drop out of college. And so I got radicalized in 1974, the same month that Patty Hearst got abducted by the Symbionese Liberation Army. So anyway, just a little framing of the Moonies from my point of view. They have been bad actors from their inception in South
Yeah.
Korea.
So do you remember how you were recruited? Because the way the
Women,
Moonies went about it,
women.
it was cares. What was that? Yeah, of course it was women. So they would love bomb,
Yeah,
right?
they
No,
were.
no, the love bombing was super
Yeah.
effective. The love bombing is they would bring you to a group home and everyone would tell you how great you were. You wouldn't sleep that much. There's free food. Everyone is having a nice time. And after 2 weeks, they put a phone in your hand and you say, please see if you can get a leave of absence from my university. This is a way better
Yeah, there were
lifestyle
no
for me.
cell phones in 74.
No, of course, you just go to whatever the group phone is in the house. And you pick it up and you're like, yeah, I'm
I
not
know
coming
it
back.
well. I was the assistant director of the Flushing Center in Queens, New
Huh.
York, and made to set up CARP at Queens College, and then became.
But they were brilliant, Steve, because they wouldn't say that they were Moonies. They would say that they were an organization, the Organization for the Advancement of American Research, or the advancement, if you
Collegiate
remember,
Association for the Researcher Principles, or One World Crusade, and we were taught to do heavenly deception
yeah.
because the world is filled with Satan's children and we're
Yeah,
God's
of
children.
course.
I know it very
Yeah.
well, and I've had a career of 48 years helping people get out of all.
But the idea is that the organizations often have a need that they have to disguise. And generally, in Gallup surveys, the people who Americans trust the most are scientists. Now, one of the weird things is that a genius of persuasion, a man named Frank Luntz, he understood that and he came up with two novel approaches. One is all science denying operations have to find scientists willing to support their causes. And there are people who, their rent is due. There's a car better than the car they have. There's someone that they want to impress. And you can easily find somebody who has a doctorate who will say the thing that you need to get said. The other interesting approach, and this is sort of an accident and one that I think Luntz never considered, is that if you have enough scientists saying things that aren't true, eventually you lose the advantage. The other side loses the advantage of people trusting scientists. So you can make all scientists look a little tetchy, a little undependable. But going back to the 20s, the cigarette companies, they wanted to get their product adopted, and it was considered bad form for women to smoke in public. And so if you can have more gender smoking, you're going to double the income you're getting. If you're Duke Tobacco or you are Philip Morris, if you're Reynolds, I can keep listing cigarette companies virtually indefinitely. But what they had to do was they said, oh, okay, how can we get the female market? First off, it's a little bit tetchy. If you smoke in public, people think you're a siren. So we've got to get rid of that. So first they had marches that were in favor of women's rights, and they would make sure people were smoking. So that would seem like a step.
That was Edward Bernays.
The cause of women. Brilliant, yes.
Oh, I put him in the
Edward
cult
Bernays.
of Trump as the basis for understanding how we got to where we are now with this.
Ed Bernays was the grandnephew of Sigmund Freud and used a lot of his great uncle's ideas for teaching people what he said. He said propaganda was the secret lever of the world. And those people, he said men, but those people who have their hands on that level are the secret guiding principle behind most daily
Right, he wrote...
Rather a terrifying
he wrote
thing.
Propaganda in 1928, and Goebbels tried to hire him, but still stole all of his stuff and used it.
No, he said he thought without Bernays, no Goebbels.
And Bernays came up with Torches of Freedom he hired models to march.
But he said a great thing. It isn't, no, but Steve, if I can add one thing, people were really, we always think of the past as being the past, but the past thinks that they are as modern as it got. They're very clever. What Bernays said in his correspondence about Torches of Freedom is they shouldn't be too modelly. Get models, but if they look too modelly, it won't reach the audience we need. So make sure they're not too modelly.
Well, we want people to identify with the actresses.
Exactly.
So we want them to have...
It's the same stuff that we face
except now it's online, and it's now with artificial intelligence. So things are getting...
Yeah, you can make people who are models but not too modelly. You can just put that in your instructions to the AI. So at the same time, the thing that they found that would get people to smoke, women to smoke, was it's better for you than sweets. So if you're going to have chocolate after a meal, have a Lucky Strike instead. It's better for your health. So initially, they marketed cigarettes as being pro-health. And so the candy manufacturers, they hired scientists to say, no, sugar isn't bad for you. And so I think that gave tobacco an idea. And by the 40s and 50s, they knew about 10 years before before the medical community began to sniff through coughing, basically, that this was a problem. And so they went out and they hired a scientist who was willing to say, and they're very clever. Obviously, if you're seeing people get sick and someone says it's not true, no one's going to believe that. But if instead you say, we need more research, then you can get by, because who would ever say that you don't need more research? So the science, the tobacco company came up with this job description, basically, and in the 50s, and they picked the kind of person who is the model for scientific denial. It was somebody who had done pretty well, but hadn't gone as far as he wanted to go. And when he was talking to friends of his, what he said was, there's two reasons I want this. I don't have as much money as I would like, and I would like to go to New York City as often as possible. Those are still the reasons that people do a lot of things.
Fame.
And wanting to be in New York and wanting more money.
Fame and money. And power. And having power.
Yeah.
But I really want our listeners, especially young people, to understand there's a formula here. Frank Luntz wrote Words That Work. He's been a right-wing strategist, even though he has been speaking out against Trump for a while, etc. But this is a formula. We now understand a lot about how the brain works, about social psychology, about how to manipulate people. And David, the theme of my company, Freedom of Mind, is I say, it's your mind, only you should control it. And therefore, the only way you can control your own mind is to understand all these techniques that are being thrown at us by people who have a vested interest for power or money or sex or whatever, to take advantage of us. And we are on one biological habitat together, and the clock is ticking, and we can now try to mitigate the harms. We're not going to get it, if we had done something in the 50s like we should have, but we have to do something. And I can't help but say, Trump met recently with fossil fuel organizations. Jared Kushner got $2 billion from the Saudis. They want to keep selling oil, and they don't want people to realize that it isn't just, us consumers that need to change our behaviors and turn off our lights, but we need legislation, and we need to really treat it as the emergency that it is for human preservation, for our children and our grandchildren.
Oh, absolutely. But to me, just part of what is thrillingly ridiculous about the story is that the Moonies, your old group, the cult, they had the same need that the cigarette companies had, and that the candy companies had. They understood they needed scientists. By 1973, in a speech called Our Future Advancement, right? What Moon said was, more than anything, we need representatives from the scientific fields, because what we should do is we should have conferences. They'll come in, then they'll go back to their home countries, and they'll say that we're fine. And that will, through this method, we will begin to infiltrate all the nations of the world. Moon's idea was that if they could get hold of 7 nations at once, then they could control the whole pie, right? Just like 7 nations is, you get control of the whole thing. And they reached out.
So I was in February of 74. I know about the international conference for unity of the sciences.
Yeah.
And Nobel laureate Horowitz wrote a whole book, Sin and Scholarship, or Scholarship and Sin, about why Nobel laureates and other scientists should not go to the Moonies thing. But I want to push back on you for a second, David, and say, from my point of view, Moon was not the architect of this. The CIA set up the Korean CIA. The founder of the Korean CIA set up the Moonies. They existed, but they organized and utilized them. And Bohi Pak, Colonel Bohi Pak, was the KCIA CIA liaison in the early 60s in the Washington embassy. And the whole anti-communists, the World Anti-Communist League, these are a group of fascists and extremists who wanted to take over the world, and they saw a religious group as a great
Yeah.
vehicle to get their agenda out. And so people like me going, "Oh, I love Father, I'm praying to God." It was a great veneer to cover up. This is about money, power, control.
Anti-communism. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've never pronounced his name out
Bohi
loud.
Pak.
Bo He Pak's daughter married the ghost of Moon's son. One of the
Correct.
most, I think, probably the most shocking marriage of its year.
Well,
Um,
and Bohi Pak raised Moon's illegitimate son, Sammy Pak, who's come out and spoken out about having the fact that he's
but to me, and I think also for other for people who've written on the church and then people who wrote memoirs from inside the church, the marriage of Colonel, I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Bohi Pak, Pak.
Yeah, but
Pak.
Colonel Pak's daughter marching down the aisle with a photo of Reverend Moon's dead son. That was one of the things that made eyebrows lift. The Washington Post covered it. And to me, it was one of the things that was fascinating about the denial scientists, because this wasn't hidden data about the Moonies. They were taking money from this cult, and what they were used for is the exact same thing that the tobacco company used the scientists for. They would go in the press and they would say, it's no different than the way Christian Science or Judaism or Roman Catholicism would look from the outside. And without the scientists, it would have been much harder to keep persuading people. It was fascinating reading the heartbroken testimony of parents who would go and talk to reporters and talk to Congress. And they said, these people, these scientists should be ashamed of themselves because they know what they're being paid for. And it's the same thing that denial scientists are paid for by climate deniers too, which is what the students like you when you were in college in '74, what they do is they say it has to be on the up and up, or why would these reputable people be with us?
Right.
And it was not surprising. The two biggest denial scientists, a guy named Fred Singer and a guy named Fred Seitz, so they're known by the climate scientists as the Freds. They were brought together at those conferences. The first time that they're the two biggest names in denial, climate denial. And the first time they appear together in a magazine story is as two reassuring names at the 1983 Moon Conference on the Sciences.
So I love talking with you, and we just put out Alan Wood's former top political operative in the Moonies, who left a few months before I got recruited. But I want to say the Moonies also hired scholars of religion, sociologists, to say there's no such thing as a cult, there's no such thing as brainwashing. Who are we to say? And they would go to the cults, be paid. They'll buy their books ahead of time to interview happy members, and they would deliberately never talk to ex-members or critics and report that Scientology is fine and the Moonies are fine. So that was another wing of disinformation that continues to this day. As you probably remember, there was an assassination of a former prime minister in Japan, and it brought out waves of ex-members and grievances, and how many politicians had been taken over, influenced by the Moonies. Why? Because the Moonies would supply people for their election campaigns as well as
huge
money.
Huge amounts of money. I think by '89, U.S. News and World Report said that you could not find a conservative organization in Washington that hadn't taken the money.
Yep.
And that was the plan from the beginning, was make everybody dependent on this money. Once you have reputable people saying it's not a cult, it's not dangerous, then everyone will begin taking the money, and then everybody, so that by the mid '80s, the National Review, you can't think of a more conservative publication.
Mm-hmm.
What they said is the Moonies have settled down as a good influence in Washington.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So I want to talk about another technique that Moon would do that I was aware of, and that would be to have some politician or some celebrity person. They'd say, we love you. We think you're wonderful. We want to have a celebration to celebrate your accomplishments and everything. And they would go to other influential people and say, we need your help to laud this person. They didn't go to the person first. They just deceived everybody into thinking that they were going to do something great. They come to this very lavish dinner for the purpose of taking photos with Moon
Of course. Ah, funny. Yes, of
together
course. Yeah.
and give him
Yeah, that happened. Yeah.
honorary
No, of course.
presentations of
Yeah.
awards to take
Yeah.
photos. And then the Washington Times, the effectiveness was overseas, everywhere else, to give the impression, oh, a newspaper in America's capital, it must be legitimate. And then, of
Yeah.
course, they had Ronald Reagan holding up the Washington Times. This is my first newspaper.
Yeah.
And George Bush,
Morning
who
read.
got $2
Yeah.
million when he had been the CIA director, by the way, during the Fraser investigation. And Robert Betcher, the staff director of that investigation, said that Bush did everything in his power to sabotage the investigation. He got $2 million for a speech or two for the Moonies.
Right after his presidency.
Holding up the
Yeah.
paper. It's a wonderful
It's really
paper. And then they would hire legitimate people, pay them twice the amount to have a column to legitimize them.
And just, it's a weird, this story, the story about the Moonies and the story about climate, it tells us a huge thing about America, which is that our research tends to be good, but action, we're not great on that part. It's sort of like if you had this amazing, massive brain and these tiny, like Montgomery Burns arms that just can't, because the Fraser Committee, what they determined was, it wasn't an ambivalent report. What they determined was that his aim was violent overthrow of all world governments, replaced by a theocracy that would be led by Moon and his trusted advisors.
I heard Moon personally say, when we take power in America, we will amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for anyone who violated their unification arranged marriages. And we were all like, yes, Father, great idea.
But so you could, But Steve, you could have the Congress saying that and have it be on the wire, on the AP wire, which is what Yahoo News is, and you could have it in the Times and the Washington Post and Time Magazine, and the cult continued to thrive, and politicians, the money they took came after that warning. Like, that is the story that the book tells, is something that we can see on a million issues. We can see it on education. We can see it on immigration. We can see it on our trouble with guns. We will have research, and it's like, okay, we did the research, and then we kind of walk away from the building before we're like, okay, what do we do with the research? Congress says this cult's aim is overthrow of all world governments, replaced by a theocracy that you are not going to enjoy. And that's when people in government began taking the huge amounts of money. People, you'll recall this from the time, people had never seen that much money. It was like some whale coming on the casino floor. They were throwing up hundreds of millions. Like, they were losing $100 million a year just on the newspaper you mentioned, the Washington Times. And the Washington Times was the Fox News of its period. It would package the news in a way that made President Reagan and President Bush look good, put things the way they wanted them put, and then it seemed sensible. It's in a newspaper. And then when Presidents Bush and Reagan endorsed it, it made it seem even more believable. So you have a cycle of credibility adding. And the Washington Times was immensely powerful, and it was the most vicious newspaper on climate change. And the scientists who they recruited, especially Dr. Seitz and then Dr. Singer, they were always in that newspaper. And what they were saying, and then it would be going, it's a feedback loop. It's going into the president's, that was the first newspaper the president read every morning. And he would see, no proof humans cause global warming. And then I love this headline, which the Washington Times ran. Climate claims pale in the luminous lights of science.
God. Yeah. So all I can say is I'm 70 years old. I've been out of the cult for 48 years. And what Moon was talking about back then is happening. It's, Trump is the front person, but there are very powerful forces, and I can't believe it's not majorly fossil fuel countries and industries. I think there are maybe some Nazis and other bad actors, Christian nationalists who want to make American Christian, take away women's rights, etc. But there are authoritarians using the Moonies. I don't believe that Mrs. Moon is the mastermind or Mr. Moon was the mastermind at all. And his two sons, one with an AR-15 gun factory and one with a cult with training compounds.
Yeah.
And I guess we can't forget that Moon was crowned the Messiah in the Senate Dirksen office building.
Dirksen office building. And it's a classic thing. They didn't tell.
Wow.
The people who were invited to this luncheon, what he would do is he'd say it's the World Peace Academy.
But they wanted the photos with him with the crown and them
exactly.
carrying.
No, it's shocking. There's video. Yes, it's video. It's worth seeing. A congressman from Illinois carried like one of those big crusader crowns, not like a subtle thing, the sort they wear. It's like the giant one that like the person who tells you to go fight with Richard Lionheart. That's the kind of crown. And he's wearing like an urban fur. And it is in the Senate. So it's in the Dirksen office building. So people think, well, I guess he is Emperor of the Universe now.
And that's the BBC title of the documentary, Emperor of the Universe. And I can't not say that Sean Moon brought a bunch of Moonies to January 6th and was tweeting it's Antifa, and the Washington Times said it was Antifa. And that Mrs. Moon paid Trump $2.5 million to endorse her and her organization a few weeks after January 6th. They only gave Pence $500,000, I think, and Esper and a few other people money to endorse them. But people, when I meet them, David, they're like, the Moonies, you never hear about them anymore.
Yeah.
But they're still players.
And they changed the course of history. Dr. Singer, who ended up being the most visible denier, he was like, if you had, like, there were four faces you would put on the Mount Rushmore of science denial, climate denial. But if you just wanted to have one face, it would just be Dr. Singer. No surprise that his organization was first built at the Moonies. He was in, Moon saw what he could do. And he said, if you want to start your company, start it. If you want to start your science and environmental policy project, we'll pay for it. Start it here. And his first 3 years were spent inside Moon's Washington Institute for Values and Public Policy. And its most successful product is the denial career of S. Fred Singer. He would not exist without Reverend Moon, and he cost the world 10, 20, 30 years on finally approaching this problem of carbon dioxide and the change in our climate.
Yes, and he's not a reverend still, because I know that he never went to seminary, and he was a product of a cult himself, and then got used by the CIA and the Korean CIA.
Did I call him Reverend Moon? And I'm sorry, I'm just so used to reading about him as Reverend Moon.
It's okay, but I'm still,
that's right.
And the Moonies did a whole PR campaign, David, after he went to jail for conspiracy to defraud the government for taxes. And they said he was persecuted and everything. And they said, and calling the group Moonies is like calling a black person the N-word. And I'm like, no, I had a T-shirt as a Moonie. I heart Moonie.
Yeah.
I had cups, and I'm going to keep calling them Moonies. The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial, David Lipsky. This is a book everyone needs to read, and it's such an important window into saving our planet. That educate yourself, organize reading clubs. If you're young people, do reports on this book, please, because there really is not just the news about this it was a road that just collapsed in
Oh my God.
Wyoming, but there are tsunamis and there are volcanoes and there are all kinds of climate issues that are linked into this situation that we all find ourselves in, and we can't afford to put anyone in office that's going to continue to do the bidding of the fossil fuel industries at our peril.
Hmm.
That's my. You get your last words,
Oh no,
David.
I just wanted to say that even Reverend Moon would call them Moonies too. He said an amazing thing. He said he talked. This is just how our system works. He said, yeah, they don't like the Moonies, but if you give them enough cash, at a certain point, they don't see the Moonies anymore, just the money. Um, and one of the things that to me is fascinating about the situation that we're in with climate is that it worked. Like there were never more than about 24 active science deniers. The science deniers themselves would say we're a small group having an astonishingly outsized effect. But they succeeded because we lost. We could have been acting on this in '79, and we lost about 40 years. And I also think it's really interesting, and this is why the title seemed very cool to me, is that by the time that the issue, it's like it was circling over the airport of our attention. And by the time it
Right.
finally landed after all the arguing and all the preparation and all the yelling and people blocking the runway, by the time it got here, it's like we kind of understood it. And we also got the sense that, you know what, maybe we don't have to do anything because they've been talking about it for a while. Here it is. There have been so many people denying. There have been people saying it is going to happen. There's been so much Parrot and Igloo about it that, you know what, maybe we can just let it go. And that is the great effect of denial. It just makes the waters so muddy that people look at it and they're like, maybe I'll swim somewhere else.
Yeah, except there's nowhere else to
No,
go.
I
David
know.
Lipsky, you're amazing. Let's get a three-parter docu-series on this book and teach the planet and educate people and realize this is, I say, undue influence is number two, and climate science denial and climate change is two. I used to say climate was one and undue influence, but your book proved that it's really the undue influence that distracted us. Thank you, David Lipsky.
Oh, no, Steve, it was great. Thanks for having me. It was a thrill. I've been looking forward to it for a year. Thank you again,
Thank
Steve.
you. Thanks so much. Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.